So I think what attracts people to St. Thomas is the depth of his insight into the nature of reality, his clarity, his consistency, the way in which he solved a number of very important philosophical and theological problems. There are plenty of people who are still fascinated with St. Thomas, and I hear there's a bit of a resurgence of people interested in St. Thomas's thought. I think he is simply perennially fascinating to people because he sees more deeply into the nature of reality than I think anybody before him or after him has been able to do.
Welcome to Christendom Conversations. Together we'll explore the wisdom of the Catholic intellectual tradition, engage with thought-provoking ideas, and uncover deep insights into the perennial questions. We're thrilled to have you with us. Let's dive into today's conversation. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this Christendom Conversation, Dr. Doug Flippen. I've been wanting to talk to you for some time, so thank you for coming in for this discussion. Before we dive into the conversation, could you start off by saying a bit about your background?
Okay. I started off wanting to be a forest ranger.
Okay.
And then in senior year in high school, I randomly pulled a book off the shelf in the library in the military base, on the military base, and just opened it at random and started reading. It turned out that it was part of Thomas's Summa Theologiae, and I had opened it by accident to the Treatise on Man.
Oh,
And
wow.
I just started reading, and I went, whatever this is, it sounds interesting.
Wow.
So I asked one of the Catholic missionaries in the area where I was, which was in Texas, what is this? She said, well, if you like that, you should go to college and study philosophy. So I went to the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, and the Basilian Fathers were in charge of it. And I was there during the period of the Second Vatican Council. And then I spent 2.5 years programming computers for IBM at the Manned Spacecraft Center south of Houston and Clear Lake. And then I went to graduate school, and I went directly to the not the center, the Medieval Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto, and it was on the campus of St. Michael's, which is one of the colleges in the University of Toronto. I spent about 7 years there, studying first medieval philosophy, and then moved over to the philosophy department and did a Ph.D. Got married, and then my wife and I moved back down to Houston, Texas, because I was offered a job down there, and I taught there for 6 years. We didn't really like being in Houston.
It's kind of hot. Food is good.
I always had trouble with my asthma there. It was too hot and humid. And we moved to Montana. And
Puyallup?
no, that's in Washington.
Oh, that's in Washington. Okay.
This was Helena, Montana,
okay.
The capital city of Montana. And I taught philosophy at Carroll College, which is a diocesan Catholic college, for 3 years. And the chairman and I didn't get along too well, so he got rid of me after 3 years, no questions asked. And then a friend of mine called while I was gone taking the children camping on a long camping trip. We went down to the Grand Tetons. We went out to Washington State. We went to Glacier. And when I got home, my wife said, guess what? You've got a job in Washington. I said, how's that? She said, your best friend called while you were gone and had the urge just to call and see how you were doing. And so she said, you got the urge because he lost his job and we need a job. Oh, he says, I happen to be one of the vice presidents in charge of a semiconductor Fairchild Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. You mind moving to Puyallup? Not at all, my wife says.
So she's already signed you up.
Oh, she signed me up
Okay.
already. So we moved to Puyallup, and we were there a couple of years. And then another semiconductor manufacturing company bought the company that I was working for. I lost my job. My friend who hired me lost his job. They laid off a whole bunch of people.
Right.
And when I looked for another job, I found one as a consulting programmer in St. Paul, Minnesota. So we moved there and we were there a couple of years. And then a position opened up at Christendom College. And two people got a hold of me and said, you should apply for the job. One was the chairman of the philosophy department here,
Okay.
whom I had been in graduate school with. And another was one of my former students who said, oh, I hear they need somebody in philosophy.
Wow.
You should apply for the job. So I did, and I got the job, and I've
Yeah.
been here ever since.
Oh, I'm glad they recommended you apply. That's good. That's good. That's how these things often work.
It is.
It's often well. That's
God,
great. It's very,
God has a sense of humor.
He does, and the roots are rarely straight. They're often,
That's true.
and if you go to Puyallup, that's quite a that's quite a journey. So, well, good. Well, so one of the questions that comes up a lot that I wanted to ask you about is the role of Saint Thomas.
Okay.
Someone from the outside looking in might say that the reason that St. Thomas is so important to the Catholic Church is because the Pope said he should be. And that this is how it is. That St. Thomas, we pay attention to St. Thomas because that's just what we're supposed to do. But for people on the inside, there's a different perspective. That there's a body of teaching here. There's an example. There's an approach that seems to be of almost perennial value. And it's not just a matter of authority. There's actually something there that's worth paying attention to that seems to be almost timeless in some way. Could you say a bit about that? Why are we still attending to St. Thomas after all these years?
Well, if you're interested in understanding the nature of reality and how reality can reveal God to us, as St. Paul argued, the visible things of this world reveal God and the invisible things of God. It helps to have someone who has deep insights into the nature of reality and why, if you look at material reality in the right way, you're forced to conclude that God exists. Otherwise, things make no sense whatsoever. People have been attracted to St. Thomas ever since he was alive. People were impressed with him while he was alive, even if they couldn't understand what he was saying all the time. They knew he was incredibly intelligent. He was like a sore thumb at the time that he lived because most of his confreres were more attracted to the Augustinian view of reality. And Plato was having an influence, I guess, on medieval theology through St. Augustine, who was not an out-and-out Platonist, but a number of his positions were more Platonic than anything else. St. Thomas had learned Aristotle, had read Aristotle thoroughly. He's supposed to have said that he never read any part of Aristotle that he didn't understand right off the bat. Everybody goes, wouldn't we all like to do that? Because Avicenna, for example, famous Arabic thinker, metaphysician, said that he read Aristotle's Metaphysics 10 or 12 times in a row and still couldn't figure out exactly what was going on. So for Thomas to say he had no trouble reading it or got it the first time reveals an incredible intellect and ability to understand reality. So I think what attracts people to St. Thomas is the depth of his insight into the nature of reality, his clarity, his consistency, the way in which he solved a number of very important philosophical and theological problems, and people have been attracted to him almost from that time on, even though there have always been people who just didn't like his approach to reality. But just as far as his appeal to the common person goes, I remember hearing of two people years ago who sat down and started reading St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae. They were not professors, they were not teachers. One was a lawyer. He sat down and started reading St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae, and he just couldn't put it down with his lawyerly mind.
Oh,
He
sure.
loved the structure. He read it from beginning to end, and then was sad when he got to the
Oh,
end
wow.
that there was no more. Apparently, a young woman did the same thing. I'm going, wow. There's something there
Wow.
that once people start reading Saint Thomas, even if they're puzzled, even if they don't understand what he's taking for granted, the principles that he's utilizing, because he's supposing you've had a background, similar kind of
Right.
philosophical background that he has had. There's something very attractive there, and I think what keeps drawing people to St. Thomas, even though we've been told that the influence of St. Thomas more or less came to an end with the Second Vatican Council, and there was more of a turn to the modern world. And a lot of people thought in that turn, in that openness to the modern world, we had to reject St. Thomas. There are plenty of people who are still fascinated with St. Thomas, and I hear there's a bit of a resurgence of people interested in St. Thomas's thought. I think he is simply perennially fascinating to people because he sees more deeply into the nature of reality than I think anybody before him or after him has been able to do. He made mistakes, no two ways about it. Thomas would be tremendously embarrassed if anybody said, if St. Thomas said it, it must be
Sure,
true.
sure.
Thomas was very well aware of the fact that he was likely to make mistakes that he was unaware of because of how difficult it is to understand the nature of reality. So, for example, he made mistakes about the speed of light, the nature of the heavenly bodies,
Right.
and even about the relationship between men and women. Um, uh, but when it comes to the foundations of reality, the relations of things to one another, the underlying overall order of things in reality, what makes things what they are, I don't think anybody has seen things like that more clearly than St. Thomas.
Sure, sure. Is there, of all the different fields that his work touches on, I'm thinking ethics, politics, metaphysics, can you pick one and say this is one of the things that Thomas really contributes to this field, or is something significant we should know about, or is kind of a bedrock for that field?
Well, since metaphysics, a metaphysical view of reality, an understanding of things simply as beings, simply because they exist, because that leads you into the heart of reality and reveals the absolute necessity for the existence of God. I would say because St. Thomas was probably the deepest and the clearest metaphysician who ever lived. He was able to solve a number of problems with respect to human nature, the relationship between the soul and the body.
Mm,
He was able to handle the problem of the distinction between the angels and God. A lot of medieval theologians assumed that if God is pure actuality, angels cannot be pure actualities. Therefore, they've got to contain potency. The only potency they could put their finger on was matter. So they put
right,
matter
right,
into the angels. And because it was not obvious that angels were material in a tangible, visible sort of way, they put a kind of a strange type of matter into the angels simply to separate them from God. Thomas comes along and says, you don't have to do that.
right,
The angel contains a real distinction between what he is and his act of existing that separates all of them from God,
right.
separates everything in reality from God, because God God's essence is identical with his existence. He's the only being that is like that, and it's possible only for one being and only one being to be like that. And Thomas just he applied this real distinction to, for example, understanding the relationship between the three persons in the Blessed Trinity. Because if the three persons are distinct relations and yet they have the same being, that means
Right.
the essence of each relation has got to be really distinct from the being that they all share. He applied it to the incarnation of Christ and the relationship between the two natures in Christ. He applied it to understanding transubstantiation in the Eucharist. And
Sure. That's helpful. Well, and all the examples you just gave, or almost all of them, I think were what we might think of as theological, which raises the question: is Thomas a philosopher, or is Thomas a theologian, or is that an inadequate question to ask?
Oh no, Thomas is for. It's an easy question. It's an obvious question to ask. It's an easy question to answer, except not everybody agrees
Okay.
about how to answer the question.
Okay.
So St. Thomas is clearly, formally, a theologian. He did commentaries on a number of Aristotle's philosophical works. Some people say, if you want Thomas's philosophy, you go to his commentaries on Aristotle. But since he was commenting on somebody else and trying to stick as close as possible
Right.
to Aristotle, other people say, well, in order to be a good theologian, you have to be a good philosopher.
Right.
And there is a lot of philosophical thought and reasoning that is materially contained in St. Thomas's formal theological works. So if you read a lot of St. Thomas's theological works, you can find a lot of philosophical reasoning there that can be isolated. But then you, as a philosopher, if that's what you're interested in, you've got the problem of putting that material philosophy that is contained in Thomas's works of theology into a properly philosophical order.
Yeah.
But someone as famous as Etienne Gilson, who was led back to St. Thomas from his study of Descartes and Descartes' sources, he finally decided that as much as he loved St. Thomas and considered St. Thomas as a uniquely existentialist Thomist, because he put more emphasis on existence than had been done by and large up to that time. Gilson tended to think that St. Thomas, as a philosopher, was an inherently Christian philosopher, that it's not clear how independent of his belief and his theology that his philosophy is. Because if you ask, so where did Thomas get this distinction between essence and existence and our ability to name God as being itself? I think Gilson would point to the Old Testament and say that's how God revealed himself as I am who am. And that's how Christ almost got stoned, or the Jews wanted to stone Christ on a number of occasions because he said, I am, in such a way that the Jews understood Christ to be identifying himself as divine, as God.
Yeah.
So Gilson seemed to think that apart from revelation, Thomas would not have come up with the insight that he did about how essence and existence must be really distinct in all things other than God. But not everybody agrees
Not
with
everybody
it
agrees. Okay.
by any means.
You mentioned that I was thinking about your distinction between sort of the formal and the material a minute ago, and how does that sort of approach inform how we coordinate the various disciplines of the curriculum, which isn't strictly speaking necessarily Thomistic, but it's part of that scholastic distinction. You and I had some conversation previously about how all these things can fit together to kind of bring unity to a curriculum.
If you look at the different disciplines, they can all be regarded from the standpoint from my own background, from a
Sure.
philosophical standpoint, I can understand all of the different disciplines as looking at one part of reality or another in one way or another. So the part of reality that you carve out and that you decide to study in one way or another is called the material object or the subject matter of your discipline. And the formal object is the way you look at it, what it is that you're interested in. Uh, you were the one who offered the example of the
Yeah.
organs of the
Right.
human body, which can be looked at.
Right.
It's the same collection of organs, materially speaking, but you can look at either their anatomical structure or their physiological functioning. You can look at every one of the parts of the curriculum in Christendom College. Theology studies all of being. Um, so that's you might say that is the subject matter,
Right.
the raw material for theology. But theology looks at all of being, formally speaking, as coming forth from God and returning to God. That is something they are able to do because they are able to base themselves on revelation. Philosophy cannot do that. It's often been said that philosophy and theology can look at anything in reality, but not in the same way, not from the same vantage point. So philosophy has to start with the world as revealed to us through the senses
Right.
and is not limited to any one part or another of the material world. And an understanding of the material world leads us to argue that a being like God absolutely must exist. So we include God not as part of the subject matter, but as the goal, the object, the
Sure.
explanatory principle for the subject matter. And we can argue that angels probably exist because
Okay.
otherwise there would be a gap
Okay.
in being. If you start looking at some of the other disciplines, history, for example, is a bit tricky to pin down because every discipline has its history.
Right.
There's the history of physics, the history of math, the history of philosophy, the history of theology, the history of literature. Whatever you look at has its own background, its own history. But history, as such, as a separate discipline, primarily focuses on human beings, human actions, either as localized in different countries or as confined to certain periods of time. But even though history takes, um, in the broad view, it takes all changeable, all material being as its subject matter. For the most part, history focuses on human
Right.
beings as
Right.
its subject matter. And then it wants to know, since it looks at, let's say we restrict ourselves to human beings as the subject matter of history. The formal object of history is how have human beings uh, acted over time so as to come to understand something of themselves and the nature of their actions as moral beings. So history provides a great basis for induction if we're trying to understand something about what it is to be human, what it is to act one way or another, well or poorly as a human being. History provides us plenty of examples, which is contained in the oft-quoted phrase, he who is ignorant of history is doomed to repeat it.
Right. Right.
So,
Wow.
and literature also takes all human beings as such, as its subject matter, but as distinct from history, as Aristotle pointed out, the person in literature has more of a freedom to try to get at what it is to be human and how best one should act as a human being. by being able to imaginatively create human beings
Right.
and to have them interact with one another. So the material subject of literature would be human beings, the same as how most people take the material subject of history to be. But instead of taking what has been given to us historically and looking at how people have human actions have unfolded over time, the literary artist deliberately creates characters and then creates actions and interactions between characters so as to provide either an argument of sorts for how human beings ought to act, or through the way through the way he constructs characters and has them interact, helps us to understand something more about human nature.
Sure, sure.
When you get to something like mathematics, all I have to do is repeat what's always
Yeah.
always said about mathematics. Mathematics studies the whole of material reality, or all material being. But how? What is it about material being that it studies? It only focuses on material being as quantified. And there are two types of quantity. There's discrete quantity, measurable or continuous quantity, and the different branches of mathematics have become more and more complicated as those two different ways of looking at quantity have been studied either separately or in combination with one another. So I believe Descartes was the first one who connected the two of them, and that continued on with calculus. But because quantity is the first of all of the 9 types of accidents that are added to substances. If you look at substances simply as quantified and the relations that quantity gives rise to, what you understand about material reality is applicable to any other way you want to look at reality, because you're looking at, in a sense, you're starting in the basement level.
Sure.
Substance and quantity and relations following on quantity, everything that follows on that, you are ignoring more or less, but what you discover as a mathematician is able to be applied to any more complicated or more complex way of looking at material beings. Then you've got the natural sciences. They look at, well, the origin of natural science was just Aristotle's physics or natural philosophy, and that just looked at being as it looked at material being. And how did it look at material being? It was focused on material being as changeable.
Right.
And because it was studying the same material beings that the mathematicians were, they could always use what the mathematicians had to say if they wanted to mix those two sciences.
Wow.
Then you can look at the different natural sciences. Sometimes you run into problems like chemistry and physics are often a little difficult to keep entirely separate.
Sure.
More than one physicist who has never taken a chemistry course in his life has been surprised to find that he was given the Nobel Prize in chemistry. So you can see that there's an overlap there between the way the physicist and the chemist look at reality.
Yeah, yeah. Let's think. So Thomas is a theologian,
Yes,
and yet underneath that is this philosophical underpinning from which no aspect of reality is excluded.
right.
So it's a comprehensive vision of reality, and he integrates what is knowable by natural reason, but then he brings that up into his theological outlook as well.
He certainly does.
So it's a kind of universal vision that's almost all encompassing,
Because
which is pretty extraordinary.
When God reveals himself to us, he doesn't give an encyclopedia of explanations. He simply reveals what he wants to reveal, and we have to depend on our natural knowledge of reality in order to deepen our understanding of what God reveals to us.
Yeah.
So theology is able to use all of the human sciences, all of the different branches of knowledge, and in the past, especially, it has depended on philosophy.
Yeah. I think and this brings it to another question, which is, for those who want to begin reading Thomas, I mean, if someone's interested in Augustine, the easiest thing to do is just say, here's a copy of the Confessions. start reading, and then they can sort of dive in. And then we're a long way from De Trinitate at that point, but they could eventually end up there, right?
Very good.
But there's an easy, almost obvious entry point to Augustine's thought. For someone who's interested in Thomas, where do you recommend they begin? Obviously, you mentioned people earlier who just picked it up off the shelf and read the whole Summa. Where do you recommend? And is there a particular place within the Summa or in another work that you would say you should start?
If I were to sit down and read the Summa, I'd start right smack at the beginning and just go slowly. And if the objections and responses to objections were too daunting, I would just jump from response to response to response in each of the questions. And if you didn't get something, just keep going. But most people cannot do that. That's too difficult. It's a work for beginners in Thomas's understanding of beginner.
Right.
But because in his own order, some of his brother Dominicans couldn't apparently handle the depth and the complexity of the Summa Theologiae. This is why later in life he wrote the Compendium of Theology, which is a cut-down version. So if you wanted to read the Compendium of Theology, which is meant to be a much simpler approach to what St. Thomas had to say about God and reality theologically, that would be one way to do it. Other than that, different people have written introductions to St. Thomas's thought. Jacques Maritain, he wrote an introduction to philosophy, which is worthwhile. It's not strictly Thomas. It's Aristotle and Thomas. But a lot of people find Maritain a little bit difficult because he's been described as a flowery Frenchman, and he loves big words sometimes. So people keep looking for more cut-down versions of how to approach St. Thomas, and that's why people like Peter Kraft came along, and other people have given us different introductions to the thought of St. Thomas. I'm not familiar with a number of those, so that I can compare them and recommend one. I never started out there.
Yeah, you just jumped into the deep end. That's which is admirable and heroic. And you mentioned Peter Kraft, so I do think Ignatius published at one point a Summa of the Summa. Which I've seen undergraduates really benefit from. It has essentially what you described, kind of the responses and these other elements. It's not just the responses, but there are the essential skeletal parts that you can flow through, and it has a glossary in the back, so you can, or maybe at the beginning, and you can look up all the key terms that are unfamiliar. And it does seem to be one of the easier ways. And we were talking before the podcast started about Joseph Pieper and his Guide to St. Thomas as an introduction as well. So there are ways.
Paper is definitely good.
Yeah. If you're not careful, you become a Thomist just from reading Pieper, and you don't know what's happening. And
or
you wake up one morning.
Sit down and read Etienne Gilson's. He wrote some fairly simple introductions to thought from a Thomistic point of view. Well, he wrote one that's not strictly just Thomas, but he is looking at problems from a Thomistic point of view. It's called The Unity of Philosophical Experience. That's a worthwhile work to read. But I'm not familiar with the different introductions to Thomas's thought. But people like Maritain and Gilson and Pieper and all of the people who try to break Thomas down into smaller and smaller bites to entice people to eat more or to digest more intellectually of St. Thomas. It's all worthwhile.
Yeah, it's a great place to begin. Well, one of the other distinctions I'll ask you to make, it seems appropriate to be making distinctions in a conversation about Thomas, is this question about the content, if you will, and the method. So there are those who, when they speak of Thomas, will place great emphasis on his conclusions, on the results of his thinking. Mm-hmm. And there are others who are really sort of enamored with his openness, if you will. Mm-hmm. The fact that in some cases he made a better case for the opposition than the opposition had made for themselves.
Heavens, yes.
And so he really does take the strongest form of the argument that he's about to oppose and articulates it in crystalline form.
Right.
But there's an openness that seems in a pluralistic society in which there are a lot of different streams of thought and opposition to some what used to be considered basic fundamental truths about reality, that Thomas's method is something that we could learn a lot from. So however much we can learn, which is a great deal, from the conclusions he reaches, we can learn as much from the openness and the way he treated those positions that he disagreed with. Could you say a bit about the method? Because it looks different when you open up when you open up the Summa, you're confronted with a different kind of structure and a different kind of method than you might find, say, opening the Confessions, for example.
Definitely. No, I mean, if you looked at a real early work of his called On Being and Essence, that has a different structure. It's just a number of chapters.
Yeah.
But if you look at his Summa contra Gentiles, or On the Truth of the Catholic Faith, his Summa Theologiae, his Disputed Questions on Truth, Disputed Questions on the Power of God. He's got a Disputed Questions on Evil. He's got a number of different areas that he's treated in a similar fashion. But like you said, his method is to take what history has revealed to be the most serious problems, the most vexing questions in different areas of human thought in trying to understand reality, to state those questions as clearly as possible, and then to give a number of arguments from one point of view, from one side, that the question should be solved or settled in one way, and then sometimes, depending how complex the work is, he'll turn around and give a number of contrary objections,
Right.
which he doesn't necessarily always agree with. But generally, he's more sympathetic to those than to the first set, and then he'll say, well, okay, we have this question, we have this problem, and here are ways in which people have argued that we should handle the problem. What am I going to say? What am I going to do with this? And as far as possible, he will take account of what was true in what a number of the objectors said, and give the clearest, most concise, most coherent response to the question and how to handle it. And then, so as to leave no stone unturned, he tends to answer every one of those objections,
Right.
if he hasn't already handled it in his own general response to the question. Sometimes this method could get very detailed.
Right.
It can be a long list of 18, 20, 25 objections, 4 or 5 say on the contrary objections.
Sure.
And then he's got to respond to just about every one of those objections. But what is delightful about St. Thomas, and the same goes with Aristotle, is their absolute openness to the nature of reality.
Right.
It's as if they were willing to learn from anybody. Aristotle begins his metaphysics and some of his other works looking back at what have people said about this topic up to now. And then he tries to, and Aristotle laid out the method very, very clearly. If a number of persons have thought a particular way on a particular topic, it's probably true. Or there's probably something true to it, because the human mind, as such, has a natural inclination to know what's true about reality, as opposed to falsifying things. So this is why, because of the natural inclination to know and to understand reality, the natural desire to understand reality, our dislike of being lied to, Thomas is open to what anybody had to say, although every now and then Thomas will get a little irritated at someone, and he'll say, that is really stupid. Like if someone decides that God is prime matter.
Right. Yeah. the personality starts to come through a little bit more in the and that's interesting. Well, maybe thinking about that element, if it ties back into something else that I had asked earlier, which is that um, Thomas in relation to other philosophers and theologians that often have our attention, or we attend to closely. Something about John Paul II. Cardinal Newman has been in the news recently, having been declared a doctor of the church. How do you, if in terms of a constellation of thinkers, how do you place Thomas in relation to someone like John Paul II, and maybe anyone else you want to mention? Is John Paul II, was he a phenomenologist? Was he a Thomist? I mean, he studied both. He was influenced by both. How do you sort of think about Thomas and his role in their work?
Well, if I take John Paul II,
Sure.
John Paul II went to the Angelicum in Rome, and I believe he had Father Garrigou Lagrange as one of his teachers, although he was familiar also with what was going on philosophically in Europe. And I think he was aware of Maritain. I'm not sure right now about Gilson, but I think he was aware of attempts to digest the thought of St. Thomas and to put it in more modern terms, to make it confront more modern problems. So before John Paul II ever went to the Angelicum, he had to study in the underground seminary in Krakow under Nazi occupation. And he was given a textbook in metaphysics to learn on his own. And he argued that he states, is one of his autobiographical comments, that during his lunch break, he would sit there and try to read that metaphysical text.
Right.
And that he wrestled with it for months.
Sure.
Until finally, he said, the light went on in my mind, and I began to see reality from a metaphysical point of view. From there, he goes to the Angelicum. He's already more inclined to the thought of St. Thomas, but at the Angelicum, he studies with Father Garrigou Lagrange. He does a thesis on, I think it's faith according to St. John Paul of the Cross. And at the very end of that thesis, he says, actually, I learned more from St. Thomas about this topic than I did from St. John of the Cross.
That's funny.
But he goes back to Poland and is assigned duty as a common parish priest. He's quite happy doing that until he's asked to go get a second thesis, a Ph.D. thesis. And he had the topic handed to him, which a lot of people would not like in this day and age.
Sure.
It was evaluate the ethics of Max Scheler, the most famous of the phenomenologists who were interested in ethics, and determine whether or not Max Scheler's ethics is usable by the Catholic Church for purposes of evangelization. In order to do that, since Max Scheler's work was in German, Pope John Paul II translated it into Polish, and so that he could understand from beginning to end what was going on in that work. He evaluated the work, decided that no, his ethics is not useful for Catholic evangelization purposes, for different reasons. But because of his work with Max Scheler, because of his knowledge of Roman Ingarden, who was a Polish phenomenologist, because of what he learned about phenomenology, even when he's writing his Love and Responsibility, he is utilizing two different philosophical methods at the same time, and he tells us how he's comparing them.
Right.
He uses the phenomenological method as a way of beginning to approach a problem, how to outline a problem, how to describe a problem, the different things that are involved in a problem. But he said, when it comes to getting to the bottom of the problem and giving an answer, you've got to go beyond phenomenology,
Right.
because they did not want causal they were not interested in reasoned causal explanations of things. They wanted to be able to intuit essences. And he said, you've got to go beyond the phenomenological method and utilize a metaphysical approach to these problems.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a kind of, he was able to distinguish what was useful in each, and, make distinctions about how, to what extent those things could come together and be brought together.
So when he had an article published in, I think it was a journal for phenomenological research. I forget the exact title of it. The editor at the time, Anna Teresa Timieniecka, said he is a rather unique phenomenologist.
Yeah, that's interesting.
He is not your typical phenomenologist.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So
Well, that's fascinating. Well, what if nothing else? We learn nothing else. It's a vast ocean. This work of Thomas Aquinas, and it can be a bit daunting.
Oh yes.
But there are pathways in, and maybe that's a book by Etienne Gilson. Maybe that's a book by Pieper. Maybe that's something that Kraft has written, or a McInerney. There might be different ways into this. But we shouldn't be too hesitant to avoid diving in. And
Father Benedict Ashley.
Yeah, there are lots of great sources.
A lot of people.
Great sources. Well, I've learned a tremendous amount. So thank you so much for this conversation.
You are quite welcome. Thank you.
And maybe we'll do this again at some point.
All right.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you for listening to Christendom Conversations. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. To learn more about Christendom College and its mission, visit us at christendom.edu. Until next time, may we all continue to seek the truth, live the faith, and restore all things in Christ. God bless.
So I think what attracts people to St. Thomas is the depth of his insight into the nature of reality, his clarity, his consistency, the way in which he solved a number of very important philosophical and theological problems. There are plenty of people who are still fascinated with St. Thomas, and I hear there's a bit of a resurgence of people interested in St. Thomas's thought. I think he's simply perennially fascinating to people because he sees more deeply into the nature of reality than I think anybody before him or after him has been able to do.